Hey everyone, Chat Sematary is back. I'm your host, Deanna Chapman, and today I am joined by Travis Newton, who you may remember from one of our Mangler episodes, which, maybe you didn't listen to that and that's okay, but Travis, how are you doing today?
Good. And if you did not listen to the Mangler 2 episode, I forgive you. I wish I hadn't watched the movie. Well, I don't know. Am I a better person for having watched the Mangler 2? Time will tell. Only time will tell on that one. But I'm much happier to be here, having read another Stephen King collection that I had not read before.
Yes, we're talking all about Full Dark, No Stars today. This contains 4 stories: 1922, Big Driver, Fair Extension, and A Good Marriage. Travis, had you read any of these stories before now?
No, this was my first time reading any of these stories.
Same. I only knew about 3 of them simply because I was making this spreadsheet and noticed that 3 of the 4 have adaptations, and 1922 is one of the more recent ones. That's a Netflix original, but really, I've been enjoying King's novella collections much more than his short story collections, and I think part of that has to do with the fact that the novella collections seem to be more themed out than the short story collections.
Yeah, I mean, the short story collections often have a more scattershot approach, and I think that's just kind of part and parcel with their format. And I think that with the short story collections, I'm much more inclined to open one up, read a couple stories out of it, or like skip around in it. And I feel absolutely no guilt about putting a short story collection down and picking it up later to pick up, read a few more short stories. But this, I was more content to read it front to back. And I think the format, the sort of more drawn out format and, the ability for King to take a greater time with these stories suits that reading style a little bit more. It's definitely something that, I enjoyed reading overall, but I feel like there's a fairly good variety of styles in this book.
Yeah, and to just dive right in with the first story, which I mentioned is 1922, this one definitely feels more like a period piece because it's happening in this time that we're very disconnected from by the time this collection comes out. And obviously, King's not exactly connected to 1922 either, but he's able to transport you with this story, which is being told by an unreliable narrator in Wilfred James. And I never really say spoiler alert on these podcasts since everything has come out so long ago by the time I'm covering it, but we are going to spoil all of these stories. So maybe if you haven't read it and you want to, pause this. But Travis, this is a confession, a very long confession by this character, really.
Sure. And there was a time when actor Kumail Nanjiani, who you might recognize from movies like The Big Sick and the upcoming The Eternals, there was a time when he was a stand-up comedian and he had this joke. And the joke was, he was talking about the oldest wooden roller coaster in America, I think it was. And he was talking about how the wooden roller coaster was built in, I forget what year he said, it might have been 1918, something like that. And he goes, they could have just called the roller coaster 1918 and I would have been way more afraid of it. And that's kind of the story here, like 1922. This is the horrors of growing up in the early 20th century in rural America. And it talks about the sort of systemic issues that people would face in rural America. And I'm glad that the first thing you used, the first adjective you used to describe the narrator was unreliable. And I'm like, yes, it's really important not to take this particular character at his word. There's really no telling just like how despicable the character is.
Yeah.
Because he's confessing to a horrible crime, obviously. And there are potential elements of supernatural horror that he talks about. We don't know if they actually happened or not, because again, the whole thing is centered on an unreliable narrator. But I feel he also does a fair amount of justifying his crime. And that is where I started to get the idea, like, oh, this guy's probably yanking my chain somehow. Like, this smells fishy.
Well, he puts it all on his subconscious, basically, which he calls the conniving man. And that's a very apt description for it because you can sort of see the switch flip as you're reading.
Mm-hmm.
And I really think even though he's unreliable, it's never unreliable as to how despicable he is.
Oh yeah, I mean that's apparent fairly early
Yeah.
on. The narrator Wilfred is, a manipulative misogynist who schemes to turn his 14-year-old son against his mother so that this will split the marriage, and Wilfred can actually take the wife's farmland. And his initial idea is that the marriage will split. The wife will move away to the city because that's what she wants and that's what she's been talking about. And she will sell her farmland off to become a hog farm. And he has, throughout their marriage, taken some sort of sense of ownership of that land, even though it's not his and he has no right to it. He wants it. And so he conspires to kill the wife with the son so that he can get what he wants. And like you said early on, he tries to kind of shirk the responsibility of doing this by calling it like, oh, it's the conniving man within me, like almost a multiple identities sort of thing. And he does confess to, having or feeling some guilt at the beginning. But again, all of this is thrown into question.
Absolutely. And the fact that he involves his son in this almost immediately, he kills his wife and then his son is helping him dump the body and the mattress in the well. And you really have this different kind of relationship that is forming between a father and son than you would normally expect in a story of, growing up in this rural area in the 20s. King definitely subverts a lot of expectations for this kind of period piece. And you still get a lot of the rich versus the poor, and that is stuff that's always going to be in King's stories. He definitely is not afraid to say things as they are and make commentary on, classism, racism, what have you, especially as we approach more of his recent stuff even. You can see this big change from how he used to write in the 70s when certain things were okay back then to say, and they're definitely not okay now. That's definitely changed as the decades have gone on in his career. And
Certainly.
This was an example of putting you right back into this time period, because having a story set in 1922 with the language of today would not make sense.
Right.
And he definitely leans heavily into that so that you feel like this is an authentic story, even though it's coming from a narrator who you can't really believe anything that comes out of his mouth.
Yeah, I mean, the prose is actually a really different style for King in this story. Mm-hmm. This doesn't have a really kingy voice to it. The other stories often do. And this time period and this setting is really, really uncommon for him. Mm-hmm. So I feel like this is a really atypical King story. But, you brought up earlier that some of these kinds of themes show up in many of King's works. And I actually felt this was really similar to what was going on in a subplot in Cujo, where the wife of the farmer that, lives on the farm with Cujo, she gets the son away and is basically trying to break the influence that I think it's Joe Camber, the farmer, has over the son, and is trying to introduce the son to culture that is outside of isolated rural America, and is worried about the influence of toxic masculinity from the father. It seemed to me sort of like a compliment to what was going on in 1922.
Yeah, you'll see these repetitive themes in his stories come up. I read one of his more recent books and I was like, oh, this kind of reminds me of Firestarter. And I'm always trying to make these connections back to other things that he's done. So I love that connection you've made there with Cujo. And, 1922 is a very dire story, and that's definitely a theme throughout this collection. It's not like any of these stories really vary greatly in how tragic they are. Each one has that very tragic element that King is very good at.
Yeah, well, this is very apparent early on with 1922. Like this book, Full Dark No Stars, is not a pleasant book. 3 out of the 4 stories that were originally published in the hardcover version, which is what I read, 3 out of the 4 of them are about violence against women.
Yeah.
So it's not a fun read. The other one, which we'll get to, is a different format entirely, but I feel like if there is one theme that unifies most of this book, it's violence against women. And if you don't want to read that, that's fine. I would recommend you skip it in that case. But 1922, I feel more than anything was interesting as a King reader because it's so different. You and I spoke earlier about this reminding us of the Bachman stories. This is kind of like the Bachman voice, but a little bit more refined.
Yeah.
And that really comes out in Wilford James's confession because he's quite a bit more refined in his vocabulary than you would expect, this, rural farm guy to be in 1922. He has this sort of cultured air about him that, again, comes off as sort of constructed. Like, what is this identity that this guy's come up with? Very interesting. I'd be curious to see how this was adapted for the movie, but I think I'll wait till you cover that on the show.
Yeah, I haven't watched it. It was one of those things where I think it came out not too long after I started or just before I started the podcast. And I was like, I know it'll be a while before I get to it, but I'll just watch it. It's not going anywhere. It's a Netflix original. And I believe it stars Thomas Jane, who we know from The Mist, among other things.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this is one that I'm not sure would adapt well to film just because of the unreliable narrator thing. It's difficult to pull that off in terms of perspective of film, because if you are shown something you believe to be real, it's difficult for the film to kind of walk that back.
Yeah.
But I do wish if this story would have expanded upon anything, it would be the supernatural horror aspect of it. There is this really gruesome and kind of awesome concept in the story about the ghost of the wife controlling the rats in the home. And eventually later on when he moves to, I forget what city it is. I don't know.
Hemingford
if it's Omaha.
Home.
Okay. Yeah. So later on when he's, in his hotel room and writing out his confession, there's this idea that he's consumed by the rats. And it's like, ooh, that's a pretty damn good ending.
I do recall rats being a big part of the marketing for the movie. So that might be a good sign, depending on how much you
from the trailer.
can handle watching rats.
They're okay with me. But that's all I have to say about 1922.
Yeah. So next up, we have Big Driver. Like you said, lots of violence against women in this story. But I think this one has a bit of a different outcome. And this one was another one that was adapted, and I haven't watched it yet. I do own it. It came in some sort of set that I bought because I was trying to pick up a bunch of these. But you have your main character, Tess, who is a writer, because King also cannot write stories without including writers.
Writes what he knows.
Yeah, and that's a big part of not every single story that he writes, obviously, but usually within his collections, you'll kind of find one or two stories about a writer, depending on if it's, a novella or a short story collection. There's opportunity to have more of those kinds of stories, but I want to say in almost every collection, there's at least one.
Mm-hmm. So Tess is sort of an interesting protagonist here because not only is she a writer, but she writes a very oddly specific kind of book. She writes a series of books about this like knitting society, this group of women who solves like
cozy mysteries.
Yeah, exactly. Cozy mysteries. And I loved that. And at the beginning of the story, she gets a call from, I think it's a librarian, and she accepts the invitation to go to this like fan event. Mm-hmm. And she accepts because she's not going to turn down, I forget how much they're paying her, but it's like no small sum of money. And it's like pretty local for her. She can drive there. I think it's just across the state line.
Yeah.
And it's a Q&A and a signing at a local library there. So she goes, and it's a short trip, and the event goes fine, but she does catch some traffic on the way there. And the woman who organizes this event recommends a shortcut that Tess, our protagonist, can take on her way home. And so Tess takes the shortcut. She has this GPS unit. This story is set in a time when GPS was not built into every single car and every single phone. So she has a standalone TomTom GPS unit on her dashboard. And the coolest thing about this story, my favorite thing about this story, is about how that TomTom becomes a character. And there are other characters in the novel that basically come out of Tess's own consciousness that become aspects of her personality.
Yeah, I thought this one was very intriguing because he did something that I don't think we've seen him do in quite this way with the writer. He has done something similar in The Dark Half, where you have this famous writer who has an alter ego, and the alter ego is, wreaking havoc on the writer's everyday life. But this is more of a survival tool than anything else for this writer.
Yeah. Well, and also it's a mystery solving tool, because eventually what happens is, as Tess is driving home on this rural shortcut, there is a piece of wood in the road, a piece of white painted wood in the road with nails sticking out of it. And she hits it with her car because she's looking at some sort of derelict gas station on the side of the road. And her tire pops, and as she pulls over to this rural gas station, this guy, this really big dude in a pickup truck, pulls over and offers to help put her tire on her car. And she sees that he has the same kinds of pieces of scrap wood in the back of his car, and things go very, very wrong from there. I don't really want to describe in detail what happens, but needless to say, it's incredibly violent and awfully violating for Tess. The rest of the story is her revenge and how she exacts her revenge, and how she locates this particular awful man.
Yeah, this is one of those stories where King does go into some greater detail as to what transpires after this man takes Tess captive. Like you said, we don't really need to go into detail, because I think this is something that works a lot better when you read how King describes it versus one of us trying to describe it. It's just such a terrifying yet powerful moment for this character, especially as she escapes and, like you said, gets her revenge. And it's not often that you have something this traumatic happen to a character and they have that chance to get their revenge and move forward in a way they deem suitable.
Yeah. The revenge story that follows is pretty shocking in terms of how King plots it out. And what I found most shocking is the inclusion of the woman, the librarian. I forget her name. It might be Ramona.
Ramona, yes.
So the inclusion of her as the mother of this big driver. And it turns out she is part of this scheme to basically feed him victims, so that it's really tough to it's basically like so that he can survive as a predator. It's so strange.
Well, it's funny because he's not the big driver. He's the little driver, and his brother is the big driver. And it turns out, they both work at this trucking company, and that's kind of how they got their nicknames.
Right. So she's operating under the assumption that it's the big driver who's done her this grievous wrong.
Yes.
And that's who she hunts down. It ends up not being him. She kills him under the assumption it is. But the story goes one step further after she manages to finally kill the guy. And she, uses her voices, the character voices, one of whom is her cat, to justify looking for further details to see if the other brother was indeed involved in this scheme. And yes. So the story ends with all of Tess's violent murders being justified in her mind. Whether or not it's actually justified is, I think, left out to a perspective that's totally outside of Tess. And what really matters is Tess's perspective and how she divides that perspective up among different voices. That really is the one thing that I took from this story as anything enjoyable is Tess being able to divide her perspective up, because otherwise, I would hesitate to recommend this one to anybody.
Right.
It's not like it's poorly written. It's just really unpleasant.
That is certainly one way to describe this collection as a whole, actually. And even though things are unpleasant, like you said, it doesn't mean that they are bad. It's just going to be that your mileage will vary with how much you're able to handle. And this is a lot for not necessarily one sitting, but for one collection to take in. And we mentioned the Bachman books earlier, and those stories in that felt like they drained me completely by the time I finished the collection. I didn't quite have that same feeling with this one, and I don't know if it's just because, like we said, it's a little more refined, and I thought the stories were more interesting as a whole, but it was something where I was very intrigued by all of these stories for different reasons, despite how tragic they are. And maybe doing this podcast has made me immune to, being super uncomfortable with reading these things at this point. But it's not that I enjoyed it. It's just like I couldn't stop reading at the same time.
Well, I mean, if there's one person out there who can't stop reading King, I think it might be you.
Fair.
All right. So that's all I want to say about Big Driver. Is that cool with you? You want to move on to Fair Extension?
Yeah. And what I find interesting about Fair Extension is how much shorter it is than the other three stories.
Yeah. Well, I mean, to be fair, I don't think there's a whole lot to explore in this one because King sets out to tell a really simple deal with the devil story. It is a very short Faust story about this guy from Derry, Maine, a guy named David Streeter, who is dying of a recently diagnosed but rapidly advancing cancer. And he visits this guy on the outskirts of an airport, a guy named George Elvid.
Yep.
And, David Streeter is quick to note that Elvid is, if you rearrange those letters, you get devil. But George Elvid is a man who sells extensions of all kinds. And so Elvid requests 15% of Streeter's income to extend David's life. And he also wants Dave to choose someone else's life to ruin.
What amazes me with this one is that he just meets this guy, listens to his story, and he doesn't really believe him, but he still has this feeling like he should go through with it anyway. And I guess in his mind, he's probably thinking, well, he's probably lying anyway, so no harm, no foul, right? And what we come to find is that his best friend, who has it all, basically, is someone he has actually hated for years. And this was the part of the story where I was like, then just don't be friends with him. Like, it was kind of one of those things where I think as people get older and, you move away from friends from high school or college or what have you, it's something where you're like, okay, this person, not good, not going to stick around with them.
Right. Well, and, the eventual reveal of what this best friend Tom Goodhue did is like, really? You're gonna get you're gonna get some sort of revenge on this guy for quote unquote stealing your high school sweetheart, and thinking like that was the point where your life turned sour. Like that's just silly. Damn it, it's just silly. But David Streeter's not a particularly good guy. Shortly after Dave Streeter strikes up this deal with George Elvid, the devil, basically, Tom, the best friend, his wife, who was Dave Streeter's college sweetheart, I think, dies of breast cancer. Then Tom's college-age son has a heart attack, doesn't die from the heart attack, but does suffer an anoxic brain injury, so lack of oxygen to the brain, and he's heavily brain damaged. Then Tom Goodhue's daughter gets sick and all her teeth fall out. And it's like the rest of the story is just a litany of bad stuff that happens to Tom Goodhue, while David Streeter's lung tumors shrink and his family flourishes, and the story ends with David still hungry for like more good things.
This is definitely a play on greed at its finest with that end moment there, because he has already ruined this guy's life over something that in the grand scheme of things didn't matter because he went and married someone else anyway.
Yeah.
It's not like he was this single, lonely dude who never met anyone else after his so-called best friend stole his college girlfriend. And it was one of those things where, yes, obviously he was sick. Obviously he hit a low point in his life, but it wasn't like he was going through it alone. And I think that is where the greed comes into play here, because he sees this other person having a much better life. And sure, we've probably all been there. Like, why is this person doing so much better than I am? And most of us just get over it.
Yeah. I think it's a commentary on the sort of unfair way that we judge ourselves as using other people as yardsticks.
Yeah.
And especially the people we went to high school with as yardsticks. It's like, what makes them qualified as like people for us to measure up against? Like, it was I recently saw somebody get engaged. It wasn't somebody I went to high school with, but it was a sibling of somebody I went to high school with. And they said, achievement unlocked. I mean, like, achievement in the game that is life? Like, this is very arbitrary. What are you talking about? Congratulations. That's great. But, achievement? What have you achieved? Anyway, that's one of the things that this story is about. But it's certainly not poorly written, but it's such a simple deal with the devil story that I kind of find it unremarkable.
Yeah, and with it being so much shorter than everything else, too, it's kind of easy to gloss over a little more than the others.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, that's again, it's worth reading if you're going to pick up and read the full book. Certainly recommend reading this one. Again, not bad, but it doesn't go a whole lot of places, and like I said, it just ends up reading as like a litany of bad stuff that happens to this one dude after his high school buddy makes a deal with the devil. So that's all I got on that one.
Yeah, and then they close it out with A Good Marriage, which as soon as you read the title, you're like, Stephen King, you're not going to show us a good marriage.
Is it though, Stephen? So this is a serial killer story, and I think it's a fairly well-written and suspenseful one at that. I really like the perspective in it. I really think the wife has a really interesting perspective in this story, and the tale of how she discovers his secret, I think, is very suspensefully done. I can instantly see it making a good pitch for a movie, and it's like, oh yeah, no wonder this got picked up. No wonder this got optioned.
It's funny because I don't hear much about the movie. I'm familiar with some of the people who were cast in it, and it was adapted, I want to say 2014, maybe. I might be a little off on that, but the adaptation did come out. It is on Amazon Prime, last I checked, but this one had me first because it was a serial killer story, and I also love true crime. I just don't have as much time to read true crime stuff because I am reading Stephen King books. So,
sure.
It's one of those things where it's always fascinating, the psychology behind stories like this, whether fictional or real. Obviously, real is scarier in a sense because it actually happened, but King has a way with making these fictional stories seem like they could be real, especially when they don't involve any real supernatural elements to them. Yeah,
there is a chilling and almost mundane realness to the sort of origin story of the serial killer in this novella.
Yeah.
And it's obviously inspired by the BTK killer.
Mm-hmm.
And this is something that King has noted himself. And, this marriage between the wife, Darcy, and the husband, Bob, he goes out on business all the time. He's a collector of wheat pennies.
Uh-huh.
And so this is like somehow they managed to turn this into this is the most unrealistic thing about the story. Somehow they managed to turn the wheat penny collecting business into like some sort of successful like memorabilia collection business. I'm terribly sure on it. I can't
it's
remember.
like a mail order. They just sell them online.
Yeah. So I don't know. Maybe he's selling wheat straw pennies on eBay. Who knows? But he's away on business one day, and she goes down to check for, I think she needs batteries for the TV remote. And she goes down to the basement and she trips over a box and she uncovers this secret cubby in the basement where he hides his trophies. And she finds in there that there are these ID cards of, I think, a nurse that was murdered not long ago. And she also finds some pornographic material that, alarms her, and she starts to put together that he is the serial killer known as BD. And so she does a whole bunch of Google foo and, looks up and cross-checks all sorts of records. And she's got it figured out at this point that he's a serial killer, and she needs to start coming up with some sort of plan on what to do before he comes home. But then I think one of the scariest scenes in the book happens here, where she's in bed and she wakes up to find him sitting on the bed next to her. This was like seriously freaky.
Yeah, because it's like he knew she had found something. And like I said, Stephen King likes to add a supernatural element, so maybe he had this sort of sixth sense and was able to know that she had stumbled upon his little treasure trove there because
He put a piece of tape over the little cubby.
yeah.
And he says it's the kind of tape that almost turns invisible. Like Scotch has an invisible tape that they have. And he said he went down there and found it broken. And so he knows that she knows everything.
Yeah, and because many serial killers specifically like to keep trophies, they have sort of those kinds of things in place, especially in fiction stories. I think it's a lot more common maybe than in real life, but it's also pretty common in real life too, unfortunately. And they know when someone finds out about these items. And with this story, you get her trying to figure out what her next step is, and she doesn't have that much time. It's one of those things where she's terrified, but she knows that she has to find a way out of this. And even though she's the one who is successful in the end, not him, you still have this tension throughout the entire story where you're like, oh no, is she not going to make it necessarily? And she comes up with this whole plan.
Or the other option is like, is she going to become an accessory or complicit in this? Because, there is a time, when he's sitting on the bed and telling her all these details, like how he became the killer, how he decided to put his serial killing urges on hold for 20 years, something like that, 16, 20 years, and then started killing again. And he's like, look, I can put it, I can put it away again. And so he makes this promise, and we don't know how valid it is, but she agrees in the moment to go along with it. And the book doesn't really imply that in the meantime she is scheming and trying to come up with some sort of way to get away from him or kill him or something like that. Like, the book doesn't really concentrate on that. Instead, he gets really lucky one day and finds some super rare, wheat penny, and they go out to celebrate, and he slips up. He gets really drunk at the restaurant. Mm-hmm. She doesn't. They drive home, and she makes a snap decision while he's walking up the stairs toward her to push him down the stairs. And what follows is really gruesome.
You can quote unquote see the wheels turning in her head as you're reading this story, which I think is one of the things that I like that King does with certain characters. They might not be super well thought out ideas by these characters, but you can see them trying to figure it out along the way. And obviously, he writes certain characters who are highly intelligent. He writes characters that are very much not intelligent at all. And when you have someone who kind of is in between, there has to be some level of effort put in by them to figure these things out. Because when you have the highly intelligent characters, they probably know a lot of the answers already. Like, for instance, I just finished reading Under the Dome recently too, and there's a character in that, a kid named Joe, and he is definitely a lot different than all of the other kids his age, and he loves math, and he has sort of all of these answers that the adults don't have necessarily. And with Darcy, you're kind of like, okay, she's not some sort of mastermind. He's the one who was lying and able to cover things up for all this time. So how is she going to get out of this?
Yeah, the more I think about these four stories paired together, I think another one of the things that kind of unites them is the idea of blame. We have Wilfred James talking about how he blames the conniving man at the beginning, sort of compartmentalizing his guilt and saying that, well, that's not me, that's the conniving man. It's part of me, but it is not all of me. And then we have, in this one, we have Bob blaming, in some ways, this young friend he had in high school, this guy named Brian Delahanty, which is where BD came from. And his killing, he says, was sort of a seed that was planted by Brian Delahanty in their youth. He claims that Brian infected him, basically. And so he blames it on Brian. And then, of course, we have the idea of who is responsible for what happens to Tess, her blaming certain people and discovering that the web of culpability and blame spreads out further than she thought in Big Driver. Fair extension, we have David Streeter blaming, this downturn in his life on his best friend from ages ago, something that he doesn't actually really bear any blame for, I think, at this point. So it's another thing that could tie all this together thematically.
Yeah, and like I said, too, that's why I tend to like the novella collections a lot better, because it feels like there's some sort of consistency, even though the stories can vary greatly in, one, how they're told, and two, what is happening in them. It's not like these all needed to be very similar stories, but they have this through line in each of them, one or two through lines that really just makes it feel more cohesive.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's definitely more carefully curated than I think some of his short story collections, which, I love the short stories, but as collections, they don't read as well, front to back. I think that's why I like to read a few stories and kind of put the short story collections away. But with this, if you are going to read it, I don't see a whole lot wrong with reading it front to back, but, particularly that second story, Big Driver. If it sounds like, that's something that you want to skip, I recommend skipping it, not because it's poorly written, but it's just unpleasant. And there is a lot of that kind of unpleasantness, particularly as it relates to violence against women through this book. So if that's a deal breaker, I get it.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I would never fault anyone for not wanting to read certain Stephen King stories given their content. And a lot of his stories are not for a lot of people. I think that's safe to say, because he is known as the king of horror, but he writes so many different kinds of stories. A lot of these fell more under the thriller umbrella, I would say. And you do have very horrific aspects of this, but there weren't, haunted houses or ghosts necessarily. Obviously, in 1922, that is dependent on whether or not you believe the narrator, but...
Yep, that's a maybe.
Yeah, a big maybe, but there wasn't a scary clown like Pennywise in any of these stories.
Sure, yeah, the monsters in Full Dark, No Stars are of a different variety. These are human monsters.
They're real.
Yep.
Yeah, well, Travis, I think that covers the 4 stories. I know your copy did not have this, but if anyone wants a bonus story, you have the option of reading Under the Weather if you buy the paperback version of the collection, which I did. It's very short. I think it was even shorter than Fair Extension. It was like 25 pages. So if you want something a little extra with this collection, the paperback has that. And I ended up giving this a 4 out of 5, if I'm not mistaken. Travis, would you agree that it's really well written, but one of those that's just tough to read?
I would probably give it a 3.5 out of 5. Positive overall, but I don't think this is something I'm going to revisit. A 4 out of 5 I would consider like a revisitor. I wouldn't revisit this one, but it's not bad.
Yeah, I have been debating on how much I'm going to revisit once I'm done with this podcast. I think the big thing on my list to revisit is to read the uncut version of The Stand. I think that will be the first order of business once I get through these books, and then I take a fairly lengthy break.
Best of luck to you, Deanna. We'll get there one day.
One day. I'm closing in here. I know he has 2 coming out this year, but I think I have about 14 or 15 books left.
That's not many, considering, how many episodes it would take to cover it. It's not bad.
Yeah, exactly. Well, Travis, thank you so much for joining me to talk about Full Dark, No Stars. I know it wasn't the most pleasant read, but I appreciate you taking the time.
My pleasure. Hopefully I'll be back soon, and maybe it'll be a more pleasant book. Who knows?
Hopefully. All right, that does it for this episode of Chat Sematary. You can support the podcast on Patreon for $1 a month. You'll get a thank you on the show. For $2 a month, I will send you a Chat Sematary sticker. And if you want to follow us on social media, you can do so at Chat Sematary on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. You could also rate and review the show. That's a huge help. And as always, thank you for listening, and we hope you enjoy the rest of your day.